Okay, good evening. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right, folks. We're back. We're back with the Truth Attack. Okay, we are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need support of the members of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating. So, if you're not already over at the website, libertyworksradionetwork.com, listening through the online link that's available there, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to that website and get signed up as a monthly subscribing member. Even if it's as little as $15, $20 a month, every membership counts, and we do need the support of the audience to keep the network broadcasting and operating. So, if you enjoy the shows, the information, the discussions, the lectures, the guests and the hosts that appear on the other shows on the network, we sure would appreciate it if you could show your support and get signed up. Tell your friends, family, neighbors, and associates about the network and join the march to liberty. And if you want to get fully informed on my favorite topic on the show, which of course is the maladministration of the federal personal income tax by the IRS, the DOJ, and the lower federal courts for the last 75 years, well, actually all of the courts for the last 75 years, but the Supreme Court has opened the door to terminating it all. If you want to find out what's going on with that, find your way over to taxfreedom.com, start reading, get educated. If you know anyone that needs help answering IRS administrative correspondence or answering the Department of Justice in court, just send them to irszoom.com, where I have a document template library that you can peruse through the contents, all of the documents available, to get whichever one you need to answer whatever specific piece of IRS correspondence you've received, or whatever pleading you may need in the Justice Department, preliminary pleadings. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? I had a topic that I wanted to address last week, and I just kind of missed it and didn't get into it, and I think we'll go through it this week. The Supreme Court heard arguments about a week and a half ago on Trump's tariffs. The number of Democrats or liberal organizations have challenged Trump's ability to be imposing tariffs the way he has been with countries. And, this is a decision that's going to go 50-50 because they're right. Trump doesn't have the right to put tariffs into permanent place as though that was a function of law. I mean, the president can't write law, and this kind of tax, in order to have any long-term effect, would have to be put into law by Congress, which with the Senate, it's questionable if they could get that done. They get the law through the House, but you can't get the 60 votes you need in the Senate, probably. Now, the other side of the argument is, well, what about policy? What is the president, who leads the government and the nation and represents it to the rest of the world, what is the president supposed to do when a foreign nation does something like, say, Japan imposes a tariff of 500% on American rice? I'm talking hypothetically here because, of course, Japan has had a tariff on American rice for some 40 years and won't let us sell our rice there. But let's suppose they didn't. Let's suppose all of a sudden they threw that tariff up. What's the president supposed to do? Sit there and take it? Or should he put up a tariff on Japan selling rice in America? Or automobiles? Or other technological-based items that Japan supposed? What's he supposed to do? There's a function here of policy, that the president needs to have enough power and policy to respond to what other nations are doing. He needs to be able to respond in kind, effectively, and within a time frame that is meaningful. And of course, obviously, waiting for Congress to respond isn't meaningful. So what's the Supreme Court going to do with this? Because technically he can't write the law to do this, but policy-wise, he should have the ability to do this for a certain amount of time frame, certainly in conjunction with declaring some kind of emergency in association or with relationships with the other nation based on some cause that they've provided by acting unfairly or unjustly against American products or the American people or the American businesses. So, using tariffs is both a function of policy and law. But I don't think this is specified anywhere that says, like, well, you can impose an emergency and then have a tariff in place for 90 days. And then after 90 days, you have to review it and either renew the emergency to keep it going or end the tariff unless Congress has acted within the 90 days to make it law. So you kind of need some kind of legal compromise here, because otherwise you'll never be able to react to what other countries are doing, because you've got two parties that split the country 50-50 and are diametrically opposed to whatever the other party is doing, which, as long as you have that 60-vote threshold requirement in the Senate, makes it incredibly hard to pass any new law. When president needs the policy and the law isn't going to come. So how do you deal with that? Well, we'll have to see what the Supreme Court says in this, because they're going to have to make it up. Like I said, either that or they're going to have to come down and explain the president has the power to do this as a function of policy because the complaint didn't go far enough in defining exactly what it is that they're after. Are they after policy decisions here, or are they after preventing the president to make law? And if they're after the president for making law, what evidence of that do you have? Because nothing's been put into law. All he's done is implement policy, which he has effectively used to negotiate settlements with the country that have resulted in the withdrawing of the temporary tariffs he put in place as policy in order to have leverage in compelling the other countries to come to the table to negotiate to drop the tariffs they've had in place against American products and businesses for, well, like I said, with Japan, 40, 50 years. Same thing with Canada. Canada has locked out our businesses from the industries it needs to protect or feels it needs to protect, while it has enjoyed unlimited access to sale of its product and resources in America. So, like I say, there's a double-edged sword here. The president cannot write law. They are absolutely correct about that. But is a tariff a law? Or is it just a temporary policy element? And at what point does that temporary policy element actually begin to operate as law? Because it's been in place for so long without congressional enactment. I mean, at some point, is the emergency still there? Has it been reviewed every 90 days? You need some protocol for allowing the president to exercise this authority, which is a form of legislative authority that Congress has. Like I say, to put anything in place permanently, it would take congressional enactment. And as Trump has demonstrated, having this as a policy weapon is an incredibly effective bargaining tool. He has forced dozens of countries all over the planet to renegotiate trade agreements where they have dropped or substantially reduced the barriers that had existed to American business in that country. They're letting the businesses in, supposedly. We'll see if they honor the agreements. We pretty much know China is incredibly bad about honoring any agreement, but you'd imagine agreements with other countries in Asia and in Europe and the Middle East would honor their agreements. And at the same time, he has brought what, some 18, 19 trillion dollars in promised investment dollars from foreign governments and large companies. So, he's used the tariff and the threat of the tariff very effectively as trade policy to negotiate better business all over the planet for everybody in the country. And the stock market has pretty much recognized that. And for the last month, it's been melting up, and in the last week, it's been pulling back. And people say, well, what are you going to do about that? Actually, a pullback after a large melt up isn't such a terrible thing. A reset is necessary to bring people back to the table and find the balance. If you think you've made enough money, go ahead and sell. But as I've said before, there's some $6 to $7 trillion sitting in money markets in the sidelines at Wall Street, and every time the market pulls back 1,000 points or so, it's perceived as a buying opportunity by that cash on the sideline that is looking for somewhere to go besides a 3 to 4% bond. And we actually saw that this morning, where the market's been selling off for the whole week on the problem that they want to know when there's going to be a return on investment, ROI, on all this AI infrastructure spending that's been going out. All the big companies are laying out billions of dollars for infrastructure. They're just announcing new plans for energy plants and more AI. The chips are selling like crazy, but all this money's getting spent. Where's the return? And the market has kind of been selling off for the most of this week, leading up to and waiting for NVIDIA's earnings report. Everyone was wondering, what is NVIDIA going to report? They're leading the AI charge. If their earnings are off or down, it could be an indication of there's a problem with AI. And so when NVIDIA announced last night they had great earnings. In the morning, the market was up over 500 points on NVIDIA's earnings. Just, we've oversold the too much, up 500 points. At the close of market today, it was down 500 points. So the NVIDIA earnings brought a lot of money back to the market, but still people who aren't convinced that it's going further. And I can understand that. NVIDIA is valued at like $5 trillion, which is probably a little excessive, but they're still earning money hand over foot, and announced anticipated great earnings for the fourth quarter. So, the Wall Street is just running along just fine. It's Main Street that is struggling because, of course, Main Street doesn't have access to all that capital sitting on the sidelines because they printed $16 trillion in M1 money supply for COVID, and it all ended up in the hands of the institutions sitting on Wall Street waiting for buy-in opportunities. And on Main Street, can't afford rent, barely afford groceries, not because of Trump's tariffs, but because of Joe Biden's energy policy from day one that drove the price of gasoline, diesel fuel, and energy through the roof, which impacted the price of every product in every store on every shelf in the country, because the last 50-mile leg is delivered by gasoline or diesel. If you make that expensive, you've increased the transportation costs, which have to be passed through to the consumer. It's all because of inflation caused by Biden, which went to 9%. 7 months, Trump's brought it back to less than 3%. But when inflation strikes, the prices don't come back all the way. The pressure to go up is just relieved, and they stabilize again at the higher level. So we're stuck with higher prices. And of course, that means America's crying for affordability, which was the issue in New York from when Dami won his election. So we'll talk about affordability when we get back. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour. We'll be back in 5 minutes with more. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and let's just get right back into this. When that first commercial break came up, we were talking about how affordability has become the issue in America. And of course, it's basic economy. That's what drives the votes. If people are doing well, they're happy and they'll vote for what is in place. If people aren't doing well or they're struggling, they vote for a change. And it doesn't really matter who's in power and who the change is to. If they're struggling, they vote it out. If they're not, they leave it in. It's even if the people in aren't doing well. So it, of course, was become the issue for the youth because of Joe Biden's economic policies, where he drove inflation to 9.5%. And don't lie to me, prices didn't go up 9.5%. They went up 20 to 30, 2 to 3 times the inflation rate. Now you explain that to me. I think the inflation rate went a lot higher than 9.5%. I've talked before about how it's a rigged number. It's supposed to be the consumer price index, which is the aggregate price index for all of the major products regularly consumed by all of America. So how do you rig the number? Well, when the price of milk goes up so that it warps the CPI, you take milk out of the index. When the price of cars go up so that they warp the index, you take cars out of the index. Not everybody drives a car, not everybody buys a car, not everybody drinks milk. When the price of housing goes too high, they take it out of the index. Whenever the product goes up too high so that it warps the index, they remove it from the index. I think the actual inflation rate has been historically 10% higher than the number they've announced. So it wasn't no 9.5%. It was more like 20, which is what matches what most of the products went up, although some of them went up as much as 35% for whatever reasons. And it was Joe Biden's inflation that drove all of those product prices up, but you didn't hear one single word about affordability from the Democrats under Joe Biden. Not one single word. It was all gender identity and open border. And no, it's not an open border. So, they created the problem, and now they want you to think it's Donald Trump's fault, even though he brought the price of energy down, brought the price of oil and gasoline down, the price of diesel down, and the rate of inflation down to less than 3% in 7 months. Biden drove it up to 9.5% and couldn't bring it down for 2 years. And he didn't bring it down. That was a function of the price of oil stabilizing. Trump is now going to be able to refill the petroleum reserve at the lower oil prices that Biden drained for political gain just before an election to prevent the price going up again. Put the whole national security at risk by depleting the reserve. So, affordability, how do we address it? Because everything they're talking about, lots of new jobs, lower interest rates, inflation is down. All of these things are policies that, although they're beneficial and they're good, they won't help you next week or next month. It's going to take 6 to 9 months for those sorts of policies to actually begin to impact the little guy who's concerned about affordability right now. That ain't good enough. That doesn't work. That doesn't get you there. And I say the way to create immediate affordability for the working class of America is to suspend, terminate, and end the income tax. No more withholding of income tax from the paychecks of Americans. The government is taking 10 to 30% from the paychecks of Americans on the premise that you owe tax because you worked, which is fraud and not true, which we're going to get to here in the next section. But the way to provide affordability, and to do so next week, is to terminate the withholding of the tax. It's not due by law till next year on April 15th. Who can force you to pay a tax before it's due by law without violating the 13th Amendment's prohibition on involuntary servitude? It can't force you to service a tax that isn't yet a legal obligation. That's why they have to have your voluntary allowance on a W-4. It's not a voluntary tax, it's voluntarily allowed to be taken from your paycheck under the erroneous presumption that there's a tax imposed on your labor. A direct and unavoidable tax. If you work, you owe. You work, you owe. You rent, you owe. You get interest, you owe. You get dividends, you owe. Alimony, you owe. Commissions, tips, you owe, you owe, you owe. It's all a fraud. None of it goes in the Treasury. It all goes to the Federal Reserve Bank, a private corporation. You're servicing the debts of the American government. You're not putting money in the Treasury to fund their operation. That's all done with debt. That's why you have $38 trillion and running, $2 trillion a year. It needs to end. As goes the currency, so goes the fate of the nation and the quality of life enjoyed or suffered by the people. You need to stop living on deficits, cut the waste and the fraud, means test your social safety net programs, Medicare and Social Security, route the money to the people that need it, and don't give it to the people that don't need it. Why is Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, and Donald Trump eligible for Social Security? This is insane. They shouldn't be getting $4,000 a month. They should be ineligible because they have too much net worth. The program's being used perversely to buy the votes of the insecure elderly. It's not a retirement program. It's not a pension. It's a welfare program designed for those who slip through the cracks and can't take care of themselves in their aging years. It's not an entitlement. And it's going to turn upside down in just a few years. It's a Ponzi pyramid that's about to invert. There will no longer be enough at the lower levels of the pyramid to pay those at the higher level. There's going to be more people at the higher level than there are at the lower. Or the numbers just don't work anymore. That's why it's going to run out of money. How do you prevent that? Means test it. Don't give the money to people that don't need it. Give more to the people that do need it, because you'll have more available once you stop giving it to the upper middle class that's getting the bulk of those funds and doesn't need it. And what happens to the money? Oh, that's right, it ends up as lawn ducks in the front yard. So you need to means test your welfare programs. You need to slash the budget. You need to terminate the income tax. Let the people keep their money, pay their bills, afford the cost of food now, and replace the income tax system with a tax on government, on corporate revenues, not profits, but all earnings, no deductions, no expenses, no costs, no write-offs, no write-downs, no losses. Every single penny earned, 5% to the Treasury every month, quarterly basis. That becomes the monthly revenue the government has to live within to operate. How do you get there? You end and terminate all of the unconstitutional spending from the unconstitutional departments and agencies: agriculture, energy, education, commerce, labor, transportation, OSHA, EPA, all of those agencies eliminated. Get rid of them. Turn them into 10-man offices in the Department of the Interior to coordinate what's happening in these programs in the states, because you're going to take those collective budgets that you just eliminated, slash them 10% every year till the budget is balanced. Well, I would suggest slashing the rest of the budget at least 3 to 5% every year till it's balanced. But you can slash all of these unconstitutional agencies, about $1.5 trillion a year of spending, cut it by 10%, and distribute the funds to the state capitals to spend on energy, education, agriculture, transportation, commerce, labor. environment, occupational safety. These are all state functions. None of them are in the Constitution. And the reason why the federal budget is bankrupting us is because all of this money is being spent in unauthorized areas where the bureaucracy of the government oversee the programs has become so expansive that it's now consuming the budget. It doesn't go to education, energy, agriculture. It goes to pay the salaries of federal employees that push paper and don't do anything meaningful and don't know what to do because they're not in Texas or Maine or California. And they don't know anything about agriculture or energy in those states. Central government shouldn't be dictating one policy for all 50 states. It should be 50 different states competing to find the 5 or 6 different policies that work best in the 5, 6, or 7 different demographics that we have in America. Because you can damn sure bet the solution for energy and taxes is going to be different than that in Maine. Or the solution for agriculture would be different in California than that in what, Delaware? Pennsylvania? Pick one. Every state should be in charge of all of this, not the federal government. It's gotten all screwed up because the federal government is dictating these policies to every state. So you eliminate the income tax, you let the American people have their money, you tax the corporations, you cut the waste, eliminate the unconstitutional spending, you allocate those dollars to be spent proportionately, and under the census, you allocate them to the states to be spent by the 50 state capitals, thus stimulating economy, growth, productivity, and contracting in the state capitals and in all 50 states, not just in Washington, D.C., where it's not stimulating economy in all 50 states. It's making the politicians, the lobbyists, and the international, the multinational conglomerates winning the contracts. It's making them all fabulously wealthy without doing anything for the 50 states. Let the 50 states spend that money. It's $1.5 trillion. Cut it 10% every year till the budget is balanced. Believe me, the 50 states won't mind. They didn't get a dime last year. Go ahead, cut it 10% and distribute $1.35 trillion. We're cool with that. Next year, only give us 1.1, and we're good with that too. You want to balance the budget? Here's how you do it. You want to create affordability? Here's how you do it. Get rid of the income tax. Let the American people keep their money. And we can fix the housing crisis too. We'll talk about that when we come back from the commercial break, which is coming up here in just a minute or two. So let's just keep going along with this. You know, if it's the fact that you're losing 20% of your paycheck that has made it impossible to afford living the way you have. Everything has gone up. Food, rent, utility, energy, transportation, everything. How are you going to afford that if you don't get an increase, commensurate increase in wages, which isn't what happens? Prices go up, but not the wages. If wages go up, they'll have to raise the price of the products even higher. That's when inflation really hits, is when it drives wages up. So it is a problem. And there is a solution. The government's just not open to it. Nobody wants to talk about it. How you want to put money back into the American people's pockets, make things more affordable. You ain't going to bring the prices down. The only way to do it is to put money in their pocket. Even a $2,000 tariff dividend won't do it. That's only one check, one time. And look what it did last time. It drove inflation to 9.5%. So no, that's not a good idea. Let's apply the tariff money to reduce the deficit. And let's let the American people keep their own money on their paychecks instead of stealing it under a fraudulent tax system, quote unquote, because it ain't a tax system. It's a peonage debt service system. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and let's just get right back into this because when we left, we were talking about how to make things more affordable by letting the American people keep their paycheck and stop taking from 10 to 30% of their pay from them. And this is how you give immediate relief to the labor class in America, is you stop stealing their money before they have it to spend. And as I said, you then have to cut the waste, cut the spending, get back within a budget that the government can live within. And the only way to do that is to shrink the government. So there's some shock that needs to happen, but better it happen to the government than the American people by glowing off the cliff to the rocks of oblivion below because they followed like lemmings the political idiots, the politicians. We need to take back control of our country. The only way to do that is to take back your political power, which means take back your economic power, because that's where political power arises. And the only way to do that is to take it away from them, because they've been stealing it from your paycheck. So that's how you provide affordability, is to let the working class of America take home their paycheck. That helps everybody who's working. It helps them next month, not in 6 months, when some policy begins to have an effect by an extra 20,000 people getting hired. That ain't going to cut it. Inflation, higher prices never go away. There's nothing, Mamdani or any politician, Trump, nobody in America can bring prices back down. All they can do is relieve the inflationary pressures that drove them up to begin with. But they're high because of Biden and the Democrats, not because of Trump and his tariffs. Trump's done everything right. And his economic policies are a benefit to America and probably the reason why they didn't go off the cliff. So, the last element that we have a problem with, that has become a major item, of course, or a major point of contention, is the housing crisis. And as I said last week, the housing crisis is a function of a number of different things. You have the pressure for higher prices by a shortage of supply, which is caused basically by regulations in Democrat cities that prevent building. If regulations make it impossible to build, nobody's going to build. There's no incentive. You've made it too expensive. Meanwhile, putting millions of illegal aliens into the existing supply that does exist has reduced the supply available to Americans and driven the price of all of the supply up. So a shortage of units available is one of the functions that drive prices up and make it difficult to buy. Another function, of course, is the cost of the transaction, which is tied to the mortgage rate. And when you combine the high cost of a short supply with the high costs of conducting the transactions, it just becomes too expensive. The people see the numbers on paper and they say, no, we'll keep renting. Can't buy, can't afford it. And they're right, because if you look at the numbers, it's absolutely stunning between what happens with a mortgage rate at 2% and a mortgage rate at 8%. A mortgage rate at 8% on a $150,000 loan will be taken on a 30-year term with a monthly payment of $1,100. At the end of the 30-year term, 360 payments of $1,100, you'll have paid over $495,000 on a $150,000 loan. It's $250,000 in interest and profit to the bank for not putting up a dime. Because, of course, the money was created based on your signature and promise to repay. The bank manufactures the cash as a function of accounting, gives it to you, and you put it back in the bank. And you spend it by buying the supplies, materials, and paying for the labor to buy the house or fix it up. $250,000 across 30 years for lending you the money to get to the American dream. No, they turned you into a slave, the American nightmare. It's the economic enslavement, the American nightmare. You don't really own it. You just work your whole life on it. But you don't really own it. The bank does. You just live on it and work it for your whole life. You know, like the slaves and the peons from the 10th century. Now, what happens if instead of borrowing $150,000 on a 30-year term at 8%, what happens if you borrow $150,000 at 2% on a 15-year term, half the time? Well, if you can get a 2% loan, your monthly payment will only be $750. $350 less. $350 less than the 30-year term. And at the end of the 15 years, the loan will be completely repaid by $185,000 in payments. The bank makes $35,000 instead of $250,000. And you're out of debt in 15 years. Now, that's a lot closer to the American dream I heard about. I don't know what this 50-year mortgage is about. That's virtual enslavement. If we're going to have a paper money system, why don't we use it in a way that benefits the American people directly by promoting and enabling home ownership? How do you do that? You let the American people borrow directly from the Federal Reserve Bank at 2%. Primary residences, maximum borrowing amount, I don't know, 150, 250? 2% assumable. You're never going to get a better rate than 2% if the loan is assumable by the next person that buys the house. You're guaranteed that loan will be repaid. If not by the original borrower, by the person that assumes the 2% loan. And they take that 2% loan and put whatever additional money they need to on top of it to buy the home after it's appreciated, being owned by the first owner for 10 years, and he jumps out of his 2% loan at 10% after 10 years. And it's assumed by the next party. It doesn't have to be paid off. And this way, the money works for the American people to promote ownership at affordable rates and reasonable terms. 2%, 15 years, not 8% at 30. Or 6% at 50. Oh my God. I can't even imagine how the numbers work out on a 50-year loan. You're probably paying $500,000. $600,000 in interest to the bank. Talk about insane. That's not a solution. That's slavery. That's how you promote housing and housing ownership. And part of the limited supply problem, putting the upward pressure on costs and prices, is the fact that the government is managing so much housing inefficiently. In New York City, there are 6,000 vacant apartment units within the public housing system run by New York City. 6,000 apartments are unoccupied. Why? Because they need maintenance worker cars. The city can't run apartment buildings. Let them get run down and close them. They turn into projects, ghettos, dilapidated, then they're torn down and build something else. 6,000 units. Now, if those were online, maybe you'd relieve some pressure. If you didn't have all the illegal aliens taking units, you'd relieve pressure. If you had a 2% loan opportunity for primary residence purchasers of a primary residence. You don't make it available for everything, for speculators or investors, only for purchasers of a primary residence. 2%, 15 years, 150K. Now you're using the money system to help the American people instead of to enslave them. And of course, we don't have a tax system, so letting them take home their whole paycheck wouldn't impact Treasury or government operations one bit. None of the money goes in the Treasury. This is the big dirty secret about Americans' quote-unquote tax system. We don't have a tax system. None of the money goes in the Treasury. If the money were deposited in the Treasury as required by law, you wouldn't have to file a return because the tax has already been paid. They took it out of your paycheck. The law says that when they take it out of your paycheck, it has to be deposited in the Treasury because tax is money for the government to spend. So it has to be in the Treasury for Congress to write appropriation bills against it to spend it. So if it isn't in the Treasury, how does Congress spend it? They can't. If they can't spend it, are you sure it was tax? And where did it go? It was supposed to go in the Treasury. By law, it's supposed to go in the Treasury. So where does it go? Oh, that's right. Turn over the back of the last check you wrote to the IRS. See what it says. See if it says deposit to the U.S. Treasury, which is what it will say if what you paid was tax. I'll bet you any amount of money right now it doesn't say that. What do you think it says? It says pay to any FRB, Federal Reserve Bank, a private corporation. Why is a private corporation cashing your tax check? I thought tax was money for the government to spend. Why is a private bank getting the so-called tax dollars? Could it be it's not a tax at all? It's a fraudulent system that has induced the American people into believing there is a direct tax on their labor and every penny they earn. Could it be? Could it be that? Oh, what's a direct tax? What's an indirect tax? The classic indication of a direct tax is it cannot be avoided. Like a tax on $1 an acre for property. You got 100 acres, you owe $100. You own the property, you pay the tax. It can't be avoided. The acreage is there and so are you. Pay up. $10 a head. You got to pay the $10. There's no avoidance. You exist. Pay up. A direct tax cannot be avoided. It's a function of your existence. And an indirect tax can be avoided, either by avoiding the activity that is taxed or by a mechanism provided in the law that allows for a shifting of the burden of the tax from the taxed party to some other party, like, say, a tax collector, like a store. There's a tax on alcohol. You go to the store, you buy the beer, you go to the cash register, the cost of the beers ring up, and they add on the tax. You pay the tax out of your pocket, but you're not the taxpayer because you have no duty to interact with the Treasury of the state. The store is the taxpayer as the tax collector, and he never pays tax out of his own pocket. He shifts the burden to the pocket of the customer by adding the cost of the tax onto the cost of the goods purchased at the cash register, segregating the taxes collected, and then honoring his statutory liability to turn over what has been collected to the Treasury. No one's there with a gun telling you to buy the beer. The store never pays tax out of its own pocket as the taxpayer. It only turns over what's been collected from others. And liability is laid at the doorstep of the collector for what he has collected, not for what he has earned. And we find that exact same indirect shifting of the burden in the federal income tax scheme of 1913. It's collected from foreigners, not citizens. Your labor isn't taxed. And the Supreme Court told us a year ago, it's not direct. It's not a tax based on your working or your labor that's unavoidable because you worked, which is how it's been enforced for 50 years. It's an indirect tax, starting with impost on foreign, duty on exports, and excise on commodities, licenses, and corporations. So where's the power to tax labor? Since there's no direct tax under the 16th Amendment, which is what the Supreme Court said a year ago in Moore et al. v. United States. Get informed, get educated, start reading right here, taxfreedom.com. Spread the word, the solution's there, the fraud is exposed. You want your freedom back, you got to take it. No one's going to give it to you. We'll be back next week with more.